नमस्कार, आप सबका इस ऑथर एंड बुक शो में स्वागत है। नेशनलिस्ट के इस वीडियो कॉलम में आज हमारे साथ श्री त्रिपुरदमन सिंह हैं। त्रिपुरदमन सिंह जी ने 16 स्टॉर्मी डेज नाम की पुस्तक लिखी है। पेंगुइन ने इसे प्रकाशित किया है। बहुत अच्छी किताब है, हमें पढ़नी चाहिए। और ये किताब और इस किताब को क्यों पढ़ना चाहिए, इस किताब की क्या खासियत है, इसके बारे में हम त्रिपुरदमन सिंह जी से चर्चा करेंगे। सबसे पहले त्रिपुरदमन सिंह जी अपनी अगली किताब खत्म करने की ओर हैं। ये उनकी तीसरी किताब होगी जहां तक मेरी जानकारी है, जो वो खत्म करने वाले हैं और बड़ी गहन रिसर्च के साथ किताब लिखते हैं। अभी भारत से बाहर हैं, अपनी किताब के सिलसिले में काम कर रहे हैं, लेकिन उसके बावजूद अपने व्यस्त समय में से उन्होंने इस समय निकाला, तो इसके लिए उनका बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद। वेलकम व्यूअर्स टू दिस शो ऑथर्स एंड बुक्स, and today we are going to discuss about 16 Stormy Days, a wonderful book by Shri Tripurdaman Singh. And it is the story of First Amendment to the Constitution of India. I have a copy of the book. I have read the book. I have done a few videos and I have used it extensively in my own articles also as the reference material. So welcome Tripurdaman ji on this show. And first I would like to ask you that what exactly is the essence of this book?
Thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm very glad to see that you enjoyed the book and found it interesting. The essence of the book lies in the 16 days of debate that characterize the First Amendment. So the amendment debate effectively starts on the 16th of May, and it ends on and it's passed on the 2nd of June. So there's 16 days of debate, and this book basically focuses on mainly on this debate itself, but also what led the story of how this amendment came to be, which was three main reasons, and those were the three sort of main constitutional provisions that it touched. Also, one was the first was freedom of speech, because the Nehru government at that point in time was being heavily criticized from both sides, both from what is considered the right, that is then the RSS and the Hindu Mahasabha, and from the left, which was then the Communist Party of India. And primarily the criticism from the right, from the RSS and the Hindu Mahasabha, was coming in the context of India's policy towards Pakistan, because there had been state-sponsored violence against Hindus in East Pakistan, which had led to refugees coming into West Bengal, and also obviously consequently communal tension in West Bengal. And these refugees also were in a very bad position, and everyone agreed that it was the East Pakistan government was ignoring its sort of moral responsibilities towards its citizens and purposely unleashing violence on its Hindu residents. So this had led to a lot of criticism of the Nehru government, most prominently and most pointedly by Dr. Shyam Prasad Mukherjee, who was then Minister for Industries and Supplies, but also more broadly throughout Bengal, and not simply not just the RSS and Hindu Mahasabha, but also more generally. More to the point, K.R. Malkani, who was then the editor of The Organizer, had published scathing articles in The Organizer, lambasting the Nehru government's approach towards Bengal. And the government had tried to pass a pre-censorship order against The Organizer. And this order had been countermanded in the Supreme Court in the famous case Brij Bhushan versus the State of Delhi, saying that such censorship was violative of Article 19, which guarantees freedom of speech. And this had been mirrored on the left, because the communist magazine Crossroads had been criticizing the Nehru government for its policies towards the communist rebellion in Telangana. Very famously, a case had happened where communist detainees in jail had been shot by the police in Salem, and that had led to, again, a lot of criticism of the Nehru government from the left in this magazine Crossroads, for which the government had responded. Mind you, the state governments had responded by banning its circulation in then in the Madras province. So these two cases had reached the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court countermanded both of them. They were heard side by side, and they were countermanded as being violative of the Article 19, which guaranteed free speech. So that was one problem that the government now faced, was that it could not censor or suppress critical voices by using laws, public safety laws, which effectively took the view that they were, whatever was being said was prejudicial to public order. The second thrust was with zamindari abolition and the right to property, because the Patna High Court had held the Bihar Zamindari Abolition Act as being violative of the Constitution. Crucially, it had not been held violative of the Article 31, which was guaranteeing the right to property, but of Article 14, which guaranteed the right to equality, because the rates of compensation were different for different sizes of landholdings. But despite that, and the other Zamindari Abolition Acts had been upheld because it was Article 31 didn't really stand in the way of Zamindari abolition itself. But again, just the fact that Bihar had been upheld and the fact that all these laws were going through the courts, so it was it was a long drawn out process of laws being challenged in the high courts and then in the Supreme Court. And so to short circuit that process, the Nehru government decided to amend Article 31 to preclude any judicial or legal challenge to Zamindari abolition. And they introduced a special schedule to kind of preclude, called the Ninth Schedule, to preclude judicial review in its entirety. And the third was the question of Article 15, which is the right to freedom against discrimination, using which the Supreme Court, first the Madras High Court and then the Supreme Court had struck down community-based reservations in the then Madras province. By the former Madras province used to have something called a communal general order, which fixed seats in schools and colleges and, of course, government jobs in particular community-based ratios. So the ratio, I think, if I'm not forgetting, was for every 14 seats, 5 would be for Brahmins and 3 would be for some other community, and 2 would be for Muslims and 2 would be for what was then called the depressed classes. So it was a very tightly regulated caste and community-based reservations, which the Supreme Court declared unconstitutional because they violated the right to freedom from discrimination. So all of these three things came to a head, and finally Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru decided that, and I quote him extensively in the book, where he says, now, if the Constitution is coming in our way, then it is time to amend the Constitution. Because reservations and Zamindari abolition was, as he argued, had been part of the Congress program, and now that, since they had been promising it, they couldn't now go back to the people and say, now we can't, that the Constitution comes in the way, or that there are legal problems. So, so matters ultimately reached a head, and then you have the famous sort of 16 days of debate over it, where Nehru lays out his case, but equally he's countered very forcefully in Parliament by Shyam Prasad Mukherjee, who's then the unofficial leader of the opposition. And after 16 days of very furious debate in Parliament, this amendment is passed, and this amendment then enables community-based reservation. It precludes judicial review from land reform law. It creates something called the Ninth Schedule, which is a very strange sort of legal device to kind of effectively escape constitutional provisions altogether. And it revalidates sedition, so it brings sedition, which was earlier an unconstitutional law, Section 124A of the Indian Penal Code. So that becomes operational again. Sedition becomes a crime again, and equally it creates further grounds on which the freedom of speech can be curtailed. And so earlier on, this had been limited to, apart from defamation, slander, libel, it had been limited to anything that undermined or overthrew the authority of the state. And this now this changed to the interests of the security of the state. So it widened the ambit of restrictions that could be placed on free speech. And another clause was added for restrictions on free speech, which was relations with foreign states, which many, such as Shyam Prasad Mukherjee himself, believed had been placed specifically in the context of their own criticisms of India's policy towards Pakistan, as a way of potentially making a law to curtail, to suppress that line of thought. And a quick word about the title of the book. I called it 16 Stormy Days, not just because the debates were stormy, but at one point during the debate, there's actually a sudden storm in Delhi, and it starts raining, and the skylights haven't been closed, so there's some of the rain kind of gets in, power goes out, plunging the kind of Parliament chamber in darkness, and then H.V. Kamath sort of laughs and says, there's a storm over free speech, or something similar. And I think that was a very good metaphor for the whole event. And in a nutshell, I think that's the book.
Okay, Tripurdaman ji, while writing this book, because I've read the book, it seems that Nehru was that's the sense which I got as a reader, that Nehru was unlike the image which has been projected of Nehru as a great libertarian, as a statesman, in the sense that as a very balanced personality. Because two things I could deduce from this book. One, that Nehru was taking a lot of things personally. His personal rage during the debate, the way he was pushing for this First Amendment, and though especially in context of the proposed changes in the freedom of speech clause, you have also mentioned, correct me if I'm wrong, that there were a lot of MPs who wanted to vote on the call of their conscience, and they urged Nehru. But Nehru, it seems, he just kind of ramrodded, it was like he was bulldozing everybody, and he just wanted to counter the verdict which was given by the Supreme Court. You have also mentioned that the government was stung by a number of court decisions. And then you have mentioned luminaries like Justice M.C. Chagla of Bombay High Court at that time, the Chief Justice, then Jayaprakash Narayan, and a whole lot of cutting across, basically left, right, center. So, and Nehru being, so tell me something about what was your understanding of the Nehru as Nehru's personality from these aspects?
Nehru does take many things personally, and Nehru is he is impatient. He's quick. He's quick to get angry, and these are aspects of his personalities. Nobody really denies that he was prone to outbursts of anger and emotion. He had a kind of sense of destiny, and he very much also had this idea that he was remaking the nation in a particular image, and those aspects of his personality very much come out in these debates. They, of course, they are balanced by many others, which is the fact that Nehru, for example, takes parliamentary responsibility very seriously. He at no point imagines that there is sort of extra constitutional or extra parliamentary authority, that sovereignty lies elsewhere. So he's very fastidious. He's very determined to kind of work the process. He stretches things to the limit, I would say, but he never breaks them. So he is insistent that all the processes are done as they're required. So it is presented, it goes through the committee stage, it is voted on. These amendments are introduced in the constitution, is amended. At no point does he says to hell with the constitution, as happens in places like Pakistan and elsewhere, right? So I think there's very famously later Atal Bihari Vajpayee once in a speech told Nehru, आपके चरित्र में चर्चिल भी है और चैम्बरलिन भी है, meaning that two dramatically opposite types of I guess aspects existed in Nehru's personality. So he, while at one level he really wants a full debate to happen in Parliament, he's happy for the opposition to have its time and to express its opinions, etc. Of course, one of the reasons he's happy to let that happen is because he knows that they don't have the numbers, so there can never be any serious challenge. But on the other hand, when a kind of pushback materializes from within the Congress, with MPs wanting a vote of conscience, then he's very firm that this is not something to be allowed. Now, it also says something about the Congress MPs that despite asking for a vote of conscience and being allowed, asking for Nehru to sort of set them free to vote as they please, they don't actually do it. The vast majority vote for the government, and a sizable number abstain. But that's about it. And so
the situation is actually there was not much difference in what was there in 1951 and the situation which is right there. Because I also see a very interesting streak in as we talked about Nehru. So I'll take it a little further. I've seen, is it that this personal rage and this, unacceptance of any dissent from his viewpoint coming from a sense of entitlement, not only in terms of financially being belonging to a financially extremely influential and rich family, but being belonging to a politically very influential family. Because if you see, there is a common streak. If you see Indira Gandhi after Nehru, when her case was rejected by the Allahabad High Court, she imposed emergency. Then, if you take case of Rajiv Gandhi, then in Shah Banu case, when the court gave a certain decision which was not suitable politically for him, they got it basically changed. So we see, and then of course, interestingly, during Narasimha Rao's government and during Manmohan Singh's government, we broadly don't see such streak. But if you remember, there was an incident when a bill was torn by Rahul Gandhi, the Congress Sion, and I would say, eternally the Prime Minister in waiting. So he had, when they were in power, I remember because that had happened in the Press Club of India in Delhi, a bill which has been proposed by your government and you are tearing it off because you don't agree with it. So how do you interpret this? Because I want to see broad, because this is a family which has ruled our country for most of the years after independence. First directly and then indirectly during the UPA regime, that also will. So I'll talk about Nehru especially. Do you feel, because you must have gone through a lot of research, records, his writings, his speeches elsewhere also, and the conversations on the record, off the record, whatever archives are available. So what is your sense? Was it coming from a sense of entitlement? Because this is one aspect of Nehru which hasn't been discussed much.
No, it's interesting you bring this up. So I think it's tempting to look at things backwards, to read back from now through Indira Gandhi back towards Nehru. And I think that's a bit counterproductive. But going forward, you do see that there is a sort of path dependency to it. You create. I mean, if Nehru was a towering figure, and if you lay down precedents or conventions that kind of, and at this point, it's very interesting. India had no sort of long history of parliamentary democracy. It had no precedents to go back to or look back to. So when Nehru was prime minister, effectively he was, because so much of the sort of parliamentary system, especially of the cabinet, the cabinet which kind of bridges parliament and the executive, so much of it is down to unwritten rules, to conventions, to precedents. And Nehru was effectively laying down precedents, creating trends that would be intensified later on. So I think whether that came from a sense of entitlement, some people would say yes. And again, both from the left and from the right. And then there are, of course, many who would say, no, that came from the need to kind of direct social reform, to direct, for example, if you take an example of Zamindari abolition, that he had to be this kind of strong arm politician for these state-based or state-directed social projects to be seen through. Now, that came from a particular viewpoint. If you read Nehru's letters and Nehru's writings, he had a kind of almost obsessive focus on two things. One was, and he says this repeatedly, even in the context of the Constituent Assembly, we have to feed the starving millions and clothe the naked millions. So for him, everything went through that was a prism through which everything was assessed. And the answer to that question in his mind was socialism of a particular kind. And so, it functioned like a prism. Everything that came in kind of bent through that and, changed direction. Now, it's very difficult to separate the Indian state at that point from Nehru, because he was so synonymous with it. And he was ruthless at acquiring and maintaining his position. He was not one of these people who was to go gently into the night. Most people ignore, they don't see Nehru's actions in instrumental terms. It's always seen as Nehru, the man of ideas, who's doing something purely for ideological or ideational reasons. But there were many things that he was doing also for instrumental reasons, for acquiring political power, because also if you wanted to remake the country as you thought it should be, you couldn't do it if you didn't have and maintain your own political power. So this was something that was front and center of his politics. And I think this sense of entitlement that often comes across is partly from ours and also his own inability to distinguish his position from that of the Indian state. And
you have gone through the whole 16 days of parliamentary debate which happened at that time. So which are the most interesting or intriguing aspects which you expect the readers would find? I found, I'll tell you about myself. I found, especially because I'm a journalist, so I found the Nehru's comment on fake news.
Mm-hmm.
So because we are discussing fake news right now, and but he had discussed about fake news at that time also, and he goes hammer and tongs against the what you call the mainstream media or the press at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So one couldn't have imagined that somebody like Nehru, before I read your book, I didn't had any idea that the so-called libertarian and one of the most strongest votaries of freedom of press, as we have been taught through the years in our textbooks. So he is a person and who is in fact, I haven't seen such a harsh statement from a prime minister of a rest of the prime ministers of the country about press. So this was what was the most interesting aspect which I found. So any other thing which you think that which breaks those stereotypes about Nehru, positive or negative, or stereotypes about anybody?
No, I think breaking those stereotypes about Nehru is very much a part of and parcel of this book. One, of course, is and this you mentioned what he says about the press. He says that not just in Parliament during the debate, but he also says it repeatedly beforehand that and it stems from, I guess, a belief that the press should be playing what he calls a kind of what he thinks is a positive role in nation building, which is that it should be supporting the government, effectively supporting him. The fake news is, of course, very important. The other is as you mentioned, because the reasoning he gives, and I don't remember the exact quote, but it goes along the lines of, what will the people in the village think? What will the our Jawans in the army, in the navy, in the air force think if they read this? So it's effectively language and ideas being deployed that from a person or from a ideological position where you would not expect them from. It's the same language and the same, I guess, the same language and the same position that they now would argue against. So in many ways, it's a kind of 180-degree shift from there to now. It's the same thing that they criticize the current dispensation, for example, of doing. The second thing is the reasoning that he provides, the logical kind of sequence of events that lead up to this. So, and again, I quote Nehru extensively on the book. He basically says that this is something we have been promising the people, and so now we cannot go back and tell them that we can't do it because the constitution comes in the way. Ultimate authority therefore belongs to the legislature because anything else is a denial of democracy, and so the constitution has to be amended to allow them to do as they had promised without sort of encumbrances from the judiciary. This is another thing, because I feel like this is a very dangerous reasoning that is provided, and that kind of opens, and if that reasoning is accepted for one thing, then nothing stops it being accepted for something else. The argument that the legislature represents the will of the people, and therefore if it has come up with something, then that is the thing that should be done. And that by doing that, of course, is it kind of opens the floodgates, and the Indian Constitution has since then been amended, I think about 114 odd times, which begs the question at the end of the day why the Constitution is meant to be something that is not subjected simply to the transient sort of whims of majorities. And of course, after that, you've had a pushback from the judiciary with the basic structure doctrine, etc. But I think that reasoning is again something that's very interesting, because that is a kind of reasoning that would, if one was to argue that now, people would accuse you of being of basically undermining the Constitution. So that's one thing that I found very interesting. And another thing that I found very interesting was the very high standards of parliamentary debate. And you see that, especially in the back and forth that happens between Nehru and S.P. Mukherjee, is how effective parliamentary debate was as I would say, I mean, almost as an institution, because everyone has something substantial and intelligent to contribute. It's a standard of debate that I feel would be hard to reach after. So that's again something that I found very, very interesting. The other thing that I found very interesting was the involvement of civil society organizations like the All India Newspaper Editors Conference, the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, the fact that these civil society organizations were unafraid of taking a public position and articulating that position is something I think that has been rare, very rare in Indian history. So I think, I mean, those are a few things that I found very, very interesting. And if you just give me 1 minute, the other thing that I wanted to say was when we did speak about Nehru and his position is the fact that Nehru only got to that position after 1952. So after winning an overwhelming election mandate, following the death of Sardar Patel and the kind of dethroning of Purushottam Das Tandon, it's only then that Nehru acquires this sort of unchallengeable position. And once he doesn't have that unchallengeable position, of course, quite soon after, sort of critical assessment becomes difficult. And when you said that things were different during the years of Narasimha Rao and Atal Bihari Vajpayee, that's primarily because nobody really enjoyed this sort of unassailable, unchallengeable position. Generally in India, scholarship, journalism, etc., have tended to kind of be tilted towards the executive. And that's been the case since the First Amendment. And the First Amendment was very much passed with that intention in mind. So, yeah.
I'll ask you last two questions, and I'm asking both the questions simultaneously so that, while answering the first question, you can take a call whether you want to answer the last question or not. So my second last question is that, as you rightly mentioned just now, that Nehru attained, and kind of an unassailable lead over the rest of the people, or an unchallenged position after 1952 elections. Now, taking a cue from that, on 26 January 1950, we have the Constitution. India became republic, and our Constitution came into force. Within 16 months of that, broadly, this First Amendment was brought, and which was like, the amending now we have a government which I would say probably, an interim government. The first general elections of the independent India under new Constitution haven't been held.
Yeah.
Was it so? But I feel that, this term has become very, complex, constitutional morality.
Yeah.
But okay, the morality of the moral aspect, one. Second thing is, or the ethical aspect, was Nehru right in, pushing for the First Amendment? Leave apart this whether the amendment was good or bad. But did he had actually the mandate? Because was he following the Constitution in both letter and spirit? He might have been following it in letter because the provisions were there. But was he actually following it in spirit? Because it was not an elected government. So couldn't he have waited for, a few more months and let an elected government, which represented the true wishes of the people, take a call on this thing?
He could have.
And the last question is that if you would like to talk a little bit about your forthcoming book, that broadly, on what issue it is. So if you would like to talk that, we would love to hear from you. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, yes, he very much could have. And this was one of the arguments that were put forward, not just by Shyam Prasad Mukherjee, who was the leader of the opposition, but also and many other members, but also very pointedly by Dr. Rajendra Prasad, who was then the president. And everyone argued that there was no pressing need for the amendment at this stage. We could understand that there had been some roadblocks towards the government's policies. So, but there was no imminent. There was no imminent danger to the Indian state. Only in one state, in Bihar, had zamindari abolition been held up, and that could easily have been an easy solution. Would be to amend the Bihar Zamindari Abolition Act to bring it in line with the Constitution, as every other state had done. And with regards to the communal general order, again, and reservations, the question was what was the tearing hurry. And I think one of the reasons, well, not one, but the major reason was that elections were coming up, and many leaders were afraid of going back to the electorate with promises unfulfilled, of saying, this is something we have been promising you since the 1930s, and now that we are in power. And of course Nehru says it very openly, but he's also under pressure from Congress leaders in Bihar and Madras, etc., who are writing to him constantly to say do something. Is that they basically don't want to go to the electorate without having done something, and they especially don't want to go and say that their flagship policies now can't go forward because the constitution holds them up. So I think that was one very important reason. But equally, you are right that he could and should have waited, because by doing it as he did, I think Shyam Prasad Mukherjee very pointedly called it treating the constitution like a scrap of paper. And I think, again, it's a precedent. It becomes something that's acceptable. And once it becomes acceptable, it's very difficult to say no to what comes after. So he very much could have waited, and in my opinion, and in the opinions of others, like the President, Rajendra Prasad, or the Speaker, G.V. Mavlankar, or the Leader of Opposition, S.V. Mukherjee, or the sort of Congress dissident, Acharya Kripalani, everyone felt that it was that it would be prudent to wait, go for a general election, have an elected body, which would then follow, as you said, the letter and the spirit of the Constitution. Because it's important to remember, not only was it unelected, the Provisional Parliament also only had one chamber. This was a point, again, that was raised by the President, Rajendra Prasad, was that the Article 368, which deals with the power to amend the Constitution, refers to two chambers of Parliament, or two houses of Parliament. And so he, again, wanted to wait until a second house had been formed and elected. Yeah, I mean, in my view as well, he should have and could have waited.
Okay, and then now about your next book, if you would like to share some thoughts.
So my next book is again on Nehru, but it focuses on four critical debates that he has, which in some ways define the course of Indian history, with Iqbal, Jinnah, Patel, and Mukherjee. And I think that will be very interesting for people to read. It's been very interesting for me. I'm co-writing it with Professor Adil Hussain of the University of Leiden. So I think who is a political theorist. So I think bringing two perspectives together and taking a fresh look really at these four very important moments in Indian history we've found it very interesting to write, and I do hope you will find it very interesting to read as well.
Thank you, Tripurdaman ji. I'm eagerly waiting, and our viewers and readers, they would be also eagerly waiting for your next book, and as well as the Hindi translation of the 16 Stormy Days, because I think in present context, especially in India, you'll find a huge readership in Hindi. They really want to read about the debates or the public discourse on the constitutional debates has been generally one-sided over the last so many decades. So now with people like you, they are the ones who are breaking new ground on this thing, and with strong and solid academic and authentic work, but also not. I'll tell you, one of the key things, interesting things which I found about this book was, and because I am a journalist, so I have a little bit idea about this thing, that how difficult it is for an academic to have that craft to write in a book which becomes comprehensible for the common reader, and you are able to tell the story basically. Otherwise, they become very boring. It's very boring read, these kind of. But you have been able to tell a brilliant story. It's like it's actually when I discussed it with my friends and fellow journalists, I told them, I said it's like a racy thriller. Actually, you read it. So I think that craft of writing, also the way you have written it, that's really really amazing. And at such a young age, you are able to do it. We expect so many more books from you, and we will be looking forward to interview you soon on your next book. And thank you very much once again for being with us. And we'll be for our viewers, we'll soon be back with our next episode also. तब तक आप इस एपिसोड को एंजॉय करें और नेशनलिस्ट व्यू को सब्सक्राइब करें. हमारी वेबसाइट www.thenationalistview.com को भी आप सब्सक्राइब कर सकते हैं. फ्री सब्सक्रिप्शन है. इट्स अ रिसर्च एंड रेफरेंस वेबसाइट. इट्स नाइदर अ न्यूज वेबसाइट नॉर अ व्यूज वेबसाइट. और हम अपने YouTube चैनल पर भी आपको जो जानकारी परक चीजें हैं, जो इंफॉर्मेटिव चीजें हैं, वो आपके साथ शेयर करते हैं. आप इसे देखें, पढ़ें, सुनें और किताब खरीदें, किताब पढ़ें. ये ई बुक की फॉर्म में भी उपलब्ध है और पेंगुइन जो है उसने इसे छापा है. और इसका कवर जो है दैट आल्सो इज वेरी ब्यूटीफुली डिजाइन. जनरली होता ये है कि व्हेनेवर वी टॉक अबाउट बुक्स, we forget about the people who design the cover, but it's ultimately उस पे किस फॉन्ट से लिखा जा रहा है, कैसा डिजाइन है, ये बहुत बड़ी जो है रोल प्ले करता है कि उस किताब की पोजीशनिंग कैसे होती है, रीडर्स उसको कितना ज्यादा स्वीकार करते हैं. क्योंकि अंदर खोलने से पहले आप पहले उसका कवर देखते हैं जो है करते हुए चलते हुए. तो इसलिए जिन्होंने डिजाइन बनाया है उन्हें भी बहुत बहुत बधाई, और पूरी एडिटोरियल टीम को. कहीं कोई प्रूफ रीडिंग की मिस्टेक नहीं है, कहीं कोई क्या कहते हैं, इट्स अ वेरी वेरी वेल प्रोड्यूस्ड बुक आल्सो. सो आई थिंक द बैकरूम बॉयज और एंड गर्ल्स, दे आल्सो नीड टू बी कांग्रेचुलेटेड अपॉन दिस थिंग. एंड वी एक्सपेक्ट कि जल्दी ही और त्रिपुरदमन जी की किताबें आएंगी, उनसे पढ़ेंगे. आपका बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद. थैंक यू.
मुझे यहाँ आमंत्रित करने के लिए बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद अरुण जी. और मैं आशा करता हूँ कि आपके साथ पुनः बातचीत करने का मौका भी कभी मिलेगा.
धन्यवाद.